How do you actually know what you're charging for in business is actually going to help you scale? Hi, I'm Jaryd Krause. I am the host of the Buying Online Businesses podcast, and today I'm speaking with Dan Balcauski, who is the founder and chief pricing officer at Product Tranquility, based in Austin, Texas. He focuses on helping high-volume B2B SaaS CEOs to find pricing and packaging for new products. Over his career, he's worked in both B2C and B2B companies, ranging from startups to publicly traded enterprises. Now, in this podcast episode, Dan and I talk about how we actually got into pricing SaaS products and the three main levers to scaling a SaaS business. We also discuss why pricing really doesn't get enough attention in the marketplace. We also talk about how to know if you're overcharging or maybe undercharging for your products, and also how to work out what the willingness to pay equation is for a customer. And he also shares some of the common pitfalls that people get wrong about pricing when they're trying to price their product. Now, there's so much value in this podcast episode. This is not the only way that I can help you for free. Obviously, I help people acquire companies. If you're looking to buy a business and you don't have my due diligence framework, make sure you get it. It's free. You can download it at buyingonlinebusinesses.com/free resources. It's what I've used. It's what my clients have used to help us save millions of dollars and make millions of dollars through buying online businesses. Let's dive into the pod. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the pod. Welcome.
Good to be here, Jaryd. Thank you for having me. Excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. Now, how did you get into, from, going from school to now what you do as a career of, helping people price, SaaS products?
Yeah, well, I think if there's one thing that's definitely become clear over my career is that nobody knows what the future will hold. And I feel that rate of change is accelerating ever more for folks who are in school today and trying to figure out what they're going to do. So I can't say that, I had some obsession with the price of juice boxes when I was 5 years old and just knew I was going to get into the world of pricing. I've been in software my entire basically 20-year career at this point. Started out more on the value creation side and value capture side versus an engineer than engineering management. Ultimately, I became much more fascinated by how our products created customer value and turned into dollars for the business. Like kind of getting an engineering job, it was just like, oh yeah, we build this features and then people pay us for it. And no one could really answer the question like, yeah, but why? Like, they could also build the software or the thing and just do it themselves. Like, how are we, like, how does this make sense? And ultimately the interest led me to pursue an MBA, and I didn't realize it then. I was quite lucky with the school I chose. It had known for excellence in marketing, but didn't find out till very recently that very few programs, MBAs in the US, which is a graduate business degree. I may have an international audience, so I don't know how widespread the terminology is, but very few of those programs have classes in pricing, and I received my theoretical grounding there, and then I got thrown into the practical side of that straight away during our 2-year MBA program. We have to have an internship. So I did an internship out for a very successful startup out in Silicon Valley, and question on the CEO's desk. It was a B2C application developer. And they were like, hey, we're looking at doing a freemium offering and we're trying to figure out if that's a good idea. Can you look at that? So among a couple different projects that I had for them that summer, that's one thing I spent a lot of time looking at. And TLDR, we might get into it later if you're interested, but I hate freemium. I do not recommend it. It was my recommendation to them after looking intensely at the question. So that was kind of my first foray into the world of pricing. And post-business school, I spent a good amount of time in like product management, product strategy roles. So really intensely focused on, how do we create more customer value, but not necessarily the monetizing side of it, because that was technically owned by product marketing. But I got pulled into those conversations because the product marketing folks were like, well, I don't know how to figure this out either. So, we made a lot of mistakes along the way, and we may touch on this, but pricing across domains is quite different. And so, some of the rules I learned how to price orange juice in the grocery store didn't necessarily translate to pricing business to business software. But now I went off on my own about 5 years ago, and now I have the privilege of helping CEOs in their executives to build more profitable companies and get their hands into the get their products in the hands of as many customers as they can. So very privileged to have made that transition. So I guess probably a lot of luck and chance in that story is probably the short answer to it.
Yeah, I think that most of our stories in terms of entrepreneurs and even in life, there's a luck component in it. I'm a big believer in luck, standing as an acronym: location, understanding, connections, and knowledge. And if you have those four, in the right place, you understand the opportunity, you have the connections, you have the knowledge to execute, then, luck can play into your favor, with the skills that you have acquired and the place that you put yourself in. So, and I know people that have just, and I've had things in my life, investments in my life where I've just been like, damn, that was actually I thought it was going to be good, but I didn't think it was going to be this good, and the opposite way as well. It's not always roses.
Yeah,
so,
well, definitely not all roses, and we would be painting a false picture if we said otherwise. Those are for the course creators. We'll leave it just like everyone's going to be millionaires overnight.
That's me. I'm the course creator, but I like to be pretty realistic with what I say, and I think that's where I get the good reputation, the trust from in the marketplace.
I meant all the other ones.
Thanks, Dan. No, I do agree. There's so many people that are, just selling products and dreams that majority, and it is a shame. And I also came across a pricing thing with when I first started in my business, like how much do I price my course? How much do I price this product? And eventually over time it had changed based on me understanding the value that somebody's going to get and what they would be willing to pay. But first I want to ask, does pricing get enough attention when it comes to these sorts of products?
Absolutely not. I think the stats that I've seen are, so in the US, Fortune 500, S&P 500 companies, largest best corporations out there, and I think it's less than 50% of them have a official pricing function in their organizations. And we're talking about the most advanced organizations in the world for the most part. And the story doesn't necessarily improve as you get smaller and smaller. So, I had a conversation once with, at the time they were a prospect, eventually became a client, but it was a CEO, Silicon Valley unicorn, minted with, this crazy valuation. And we were talking about doing a pricing project together. And it just so happened that during the time that we were talking, he had to take a break for 3 days from our conversation to go run a 3-day executive offsite. So CEO of a company, got all of his executives in the room, 3 days. They're talking about strategy and metrics and yada, yada. We come back the next week and I go, hey, how'd the offsite go? Oh, it was great. It was amazing. We got all these things sorted. Great. How did your conversations over those 3 days affect our project? Affect this pricing initiative? Oh, we didn't talk about pricing. I know you had the most expensive meeting in your company, all your senior team in a room for 3 days, just hashing out all the problems in the organization and trying to figure out what your plan is. And you didn't discuss one of the only 3 growth levers your company has. Now, that's not the case. He did talk about pricing. He just didn't realize he was talking about pricing. I'm sure they talked about win rates and annual contract value and churn and retention rates and net revenue retention rates and the length of sales cycles. And those are all metrics that pricing affects, but he didn't really sort of understand that. And I think it's all too, not to single that person out at all, because it tends to be something that's very common. And I think there's really only 3 ways to grow a SaaS business: acquisition, monetization, and retention. And acquisition just gets it sucks all the oxygen out of the room for the most part. This is like, how do we get more leads? Like, if I get more leads, we can sell more, we can grow. And look, absolutely, acquisition is certainly part of the mix. I'm not saying ignore it, but if you're going to just totally ignore these other 2 things, it just doesn't make any sense. For retention and monetization, they're huge opportunities, huge levers. So I think it's a I think it spans industries and it spans companies of all sizes. I have rationale and theories as to why that is. But yeah, just generally the answer is no. This does not get attention.
Yeah. So they're the three levers that you mentioned before: acquisition, monetization, and retention. Now, when it comes to pricing, that plays a part in all of those levers, right? Acquisition can, having the right price can be an objection as well. But is it more prevalent in monetization and retention?
Yeah, it's a good question, and so there's a little bit of a clarification potentially on there. So when I'm saying acquisition in that sense, absolutely, like your price can affect your retention rates, and it can affect your closed won, your win rates, etc. So yeah, it's involved retention. But if we go to business economics 101, right, the revenue I generate is equal to price times quantity. Right. So when I say acquisition in that little snippet of acquisition, monetization, retention, right, it's like, well, like everyone's just focused on the quantity. Like, how do I just get more people in the door and just to sell them more copies of the thing,
right?
Versus the P just goes ignored. Like, okay, well, the P is just, it is what it is. It's like, really? Was that just handed down on a stone tablet to you? Like, that's
the P being the price, right?
P being price, yeah. P times Q, price times quantity, right? Being your equal to your revenue. Now, quantity also affected by do those customers stick around? And subscription has reminded a lot of businesses that, like, yeah, that's really important, because the ultimate lifetime value of the customer requires that they stick around and pay you sort of year after year, right? So that quantity and it quickly swamps the revenue from those existing customers, quickly swamps any new business that you can bring in, and so that becomes a really important lever for continued growth. Because yeah, if you can acquire them but they don't stick around, you got a seriously leaky bucket, and that's not a viable long-term business it's definitely in the software world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, retention is so critical. I want to circle back to retention, but the big question that I have on my mind here is, how can you sort of know or determine if your pricing of your product needs to be changed, optimized, or fixed? I know that's a big question, right? There's a lot of data that you're probably going to have to look at and analyze and come to an educated conclusion. So I guess we open up that can of worms.
Yeah.
How do you know? How do you know if your price is not going to help you grow?
Yeah. So there's not sort of a magic number for this question. So I think I would probably be looking at a few things, right? So one is, especially again, for your listeners, I focus almost entirely on business to business software, B2B SaaS. And so, a lot of the lenses and the type of metrics I talk about are going to be specific to that type of audience. And so, one of the big things in the subscription world is this idea of net revenue retention. So, I've got my gross retention. So I brought on 100 customers at the beginning of the month. At the end of the month, 90 of them have stuck around, right? So I have a 90% gross retention rate. But during the course of that month, some of them may have expanded their usage. They, if I have a seat-based model, for example, like I bought CRM, Salesforce, some of them may have added sales headcount, and so they bought more seats. Some of them may have reduced sales headcount, so have reduced seats. So there's going to be expansion and contraction. So in terms of like a number one sort of metric I want to be looking at is like the net revenue retention metric, to understand is my pricing really sort of aiding me in my growth. The beyond that, the questions really, or the things I might look at, are really going to differ from stage to stage. So in general, if you're really early on, I like this mindset or concept of you got to learn before you earn. It's not necessarily the most important to maximize your pricing to generate the most revenue or profit possible. You want to be sort of looking at the long term. And I found earlier stage companies really have a lot of big question marks around, are they delivering value? Is the product actually there? Do they have a distribution engine that they can repeat? Can they find customers? And look, pricing is going to be part of all those conversations in terms of, it's going to come up, at the at least one time during a deal, because you're going to have to send somebody an invoice or have them swipe their credit card. But it just has to be sort of not terrible versus, if you're at a little bit later stage of a company, you've got more product maturity, there's many more levers that become within the pricing and packaging world that become much more important. So I want to look at that, net revenue retention. And then, I want to say, like, look, is this helping us meet our goals? Like, has our value proposition changed? You mentioned very clearly earlier that you got a better sense of the value that was delivered. You got a better sense of your market and their willingness to pay. Do you feel like you've got something that's really, really valuable compared to what you're charging, right? And you might get that back from metrics you might look at, right? Like if you're not seeing any deals lost because price was too high, right? Like that's a strong signal. Like we should be seeing in our CRM that we're losing some deals to price. Like if that percentage is zero, you've got some headroom, right?
Yeah.
And if there's other, if there's is that information coming out in other avenues, like if you're running win-loss analysis or you're running churn studies, right? Like is price getting brought up as something, like it's going to be a balance, right? Is it getting brought up enough where you're like, okay, yeah, that feels like it's in the right place? There's very few sort of absolute rules of thumb. I'd like to see about a third of deals getting lost to price, right? So if it's higher than that, maybe too high; below that, too low. But for those earlier stage companies, right, there's usually, it just has to be in a point where it's not so confusing, especially with software, because I think one thing that's odd, it's a blessing and a curse in the software space. It's very easy in the software space to create like a 3-arm sweater. Like if you went into the clothing store, you went into H&M or whatever, and you saw someone trying to sell you a 3-arm shirt, you'd be like, what was this person doing? Like, how is, fashion gets weird. Don't get me wrong. Like but you have to like really go out on a limb to like scrap. In software, it's infinitely flexible. So you just have to not be paying attention. And all of a sudden you've got something really unwieldy. So with software, it's a lot of times it's like, look, does the whole way you've constructed the offer or the set of offers even make sense? Because you could get really confusing and difficult to explain. And it has really nothing to do with the number next to the dollar sign. It has everything to do with like how you try to say like, oh, okay, well, you pay this much, if it's, the second Tuesday of the month and, the moon is aligned with Sagittarius, right? You're like, your salespeople have to go on this long description. And all of a sudden the salesperson's like, or the prospect's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? It's like, yeah, this is just confusing. And we know the confused customers don't buy. So that's where I spend a large amount of time in the software world, is helping people with, the elements of packaging. Because when it comes to SaaS pricing, I think that is a big misconception. Most people think that what you charge determines your success. In fact, who and how you charge determines your success.
Not what you charge, but who and how you charge. So I like that lens, because you're not thinking about just the business making money and the product first. You're thinking about your audience and who you're selling to and serving. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the major levers. Pricing has two foundational relationships. You got a relationship to volume. Anyone who sat through Econ 101, either in high school or undergrad, understands you saw a supply demand curve at some point. And they're like, okay, like price changes with volume sold. Okay, I get that. But much more important for the software world is price's relationship to value. And so that value is going to be different depending upon the customer and their situation to them. And so, and just in general, tech companies do a really crap job at communicating value. We tend to spit all of the feature specifications at people, and like people are like, okay, I don't know what any of that means, and I feel dumb for not knowing what it means, so I guess I'm gonna go away. And you don't want that to be the case, right? So the relationship to value and understanding that value is incredibly important.
So that's value-based pricing, what you would call, right? So how do we work out the value, of, yeah, I mean, there's, people just going to go, yeah, this is how much I'm willing to pay. Is that one of the metrics of like you said, there's, I guess one of those metrics might be, a third of those people saying no to the product or purchasing it, whereas 2/3 would say yes. Like, is that one of the, how do we determine, value-based pricing?
There's so much that we could unwrap in this simple sounding question. So let me maybe back up a little bit and kind of just set the context for what we mean by value-based pricing, or what I mean at least by value-based pricing, because I think it's one of these things that is not coherently defined across even the pricing expert space. So God forbid you're a non-pricing expert and try to go into this world. The way I think about value-based pricing is I call it a pricing orientation. And there's really kind of three pricing orientations. There's cost-based pricing, competitor-based pricing, value-based pricing. And I say them in that order because I really view them as sort of a ladder or pyramid. Like, you don't get to go to the next stage until you sort of understand that rung before you. So why is an orientation? An orientation really helps us think concretely about how is pricing done around here? What are the inputs that we take into account when we're thinking about our pricing? And so, like, I think the default that everyone goes to, especially if you're selling physical goods, is like, hey, I made a widget. It cost me $1 to produce, and I'm going to sell it to people for $2. Right? And it's like, there's some relationship, it's like, if you're trying to sell that widget for 50 cents, you're not going to be in business very long. So we all kind of get that at a base level. Be like, okay, businesses need to make a profit because they've got to fund, all their operations. And then they, have some left over for the risk that they took, et cetera. So there's some relationship to cost. And so you've got to sort of understand your cost. But that only really sets a floor. Also, it doesn't really, like, your customers don't care about your costs. Like, your costs are your costs. Like, that's your problem. The customer has their problem. They don't care about your problems. Very few people in the world, maybe your mother cares about your problems, but like, besides that, like, nobody else cares, and the costs are your problem. And so then we need to think about, okay, well, we're in a market. So therefore there's competition. Customers, maybe they're not fully omniscient. They don't know everything, but they're not stupid. Like, they're in a grocery store and they're at the, buying laundry detergent or whatever, and they see that there's options. So you have to be aware of what you're being compared against. Right. And so this is like where we start to take the market perspective of like, oh, what are the other ways that customers could get this job done? And sometimes it's a direct competitor, sometimes they're indirect. In the world of B2B software, a lot of B2B SaaS tools replace email and spreadsheets and Johnny the intern, right? And it's like, hey, Johnny the intern, sometimes he gets sick. Sometimes Johnny the intern puts the Google sheet on the internet and exposes all your customer data, right? So, but maybe that's where you're being compared against, right? And you have to know, right? It's not just this other B2B SaaS company down the street, right? There's a human process being that you're displacing. But I think that's where I think a lot of folks kind of stop there, because the competitor based, it's very easy to be like, well, I'll just charge whatever the competition is charging. And that, I think, puts you in a very dangerous game. So I think for two reasons. One, I would say, going back to what I was talking about before, where there's only really the three ways to grow your SaaS business, you would not think about, hey, I'm going to give my closest competitors control over my customer acquisition strategy. I'm just going to let them run my Google keyword bidding process, and I'm going to let them run my SEO and my social media.
Wow.
But yet when it comes to pricing, it'll be like, oh yeah, well, like, they must have figured it out. We're just going to follow what they did. It's like, you would never think about that for your acquisition, but when we just look at competitors and just copy them, it's effectively what we're doing. And if you've been around business long enough, you probably know that your competitor doesn't know what you're doing. That's why you're in business, because you think you could do it better than them. So why you follow their lead? Also, there's a giant risk inherent in that, because every pricing and packaging decision is a trade-off. And that trade-off is meant to achieve some objective at the expense of at something else, right? It's like we
Yeah.
can't be everything to everyone. We need to choose. And so what you're doing when you adopt that, and be like, oh, well, they have these 3 bundles. This is what they price at. This is what's included in each one. So we're just going to copy that. Well, like, they have certain capabilities, certain assets, certain IP, certain people,
certain costs that may actually
certain
be different
costs,
to
right?
yours.
They're different from yours, right? So you're just gonna inherit all that without understanding what's behind the scenes, right? So
Correct.
So we need to have that, and at least then we're a little bit more market focused. So it does get us out of a better place in cost-based pricing. And then, we get to the value-based pricing world. So value-based pricing is really this idea that pricing is fundamental to, or value is fundamental to pricing, and that we are in a position where, we're really trying to understand, okay, how much value do we create for our customers? And then how are we going to divide that value in the transaction? So going back to the foundations of modern capitalism and Adam Smith, right? The butcher and the baker, they specialize and then they trade, right? Because it's in the best interest of both of them to do so, right? Versus just I'm gonna grow all my own food and harvest it. Like, no. Like I've outsourced that to other people in the economy because that's not efficient. And so transactions don't happen unless there's value created for both parties. So we're really working to then understand what is that value created, and then how do we divide that? And I think that's a really important lens because it really focuses you intensely on, especially in a B2B environment. B2C, I think you could get away with some proxies without going all the way to like value, and value could be a little bit more fuzzy in a consumer context. But in B2B, it's like, well, ultimately, we're usually helping them save money, reducing their costs. We're helping them increase revenue. We're helping them reduce risk, and those things can all be ultimately quantified. And so, we then really put on that hat to drive that forward. And so, look, you can also kind of bounce between the layers, but I think that's the kind of the appropriate way to go. I think that for most earlier stage companies, first of all, true value-based pricing is not widely adopted. I think the numbers I've seen are, when kind of the pricing organizations do broad-based surveys on this, is like less than 20% of organizations in total do what would approach value-based pricing, because it's an entire go-to-market approach. It's not just something you can kind of do in your pricing organization and then just, hey, the pricing people went into a room and calculated this how much value, and then it's like, here you go, sales guy, like, sell this because this is our value. Because we all know what happens then is the buyer's like, yeah, that's interesting that you say you can make me that much money. Like, prove it, show me. And then they're gonna be like, no, I don't know how to do that. Would you like a discount? So it really needs to be supported throughout the whole organization to be successful. And just many companies are not kind of that mature yet in their journey. So I think it's a sort of an aspiration. It's a North Star to be, to guide us, never to be reached. But I think it's important even at the earlier stages to at least be having those type of conversations with your customers, that you really understand how you're helping them improve their business.
Yeah, absolutely. When you say that, and you talk about the difference in, there can be the lines can be a little bit blurred between pricing for B2C versus B2B. B2C, it seems like it's more around how does this make you feel, and the value can be how it makes you feel, which can also be like a placebo effect as well. I know that with other products, like value is based, like with B2C, it can be more based on like the perceived value, versus B2B seems like it's very logical and analytical, and it is, what's the ROI that I'm going to get if I switch over to this product? Would you say there's some holes in what I've just said there?
No, I think that's well put. So one of the big framework, so there's a couple of, I stand on the shoulders of giants. Let me say, there's a couple of frameworks that I did not come up with, but I use regularly, and one of them is what's called Jobs to be Done, and it has many fathers. Tony Ulwick is one who's particularly prolific in this space. He's got a great book called What Customers Want. I highly recommend. But it goes all the way back. There's a Clay Christensen who now passed on, who was a pretty famous marketing professor at Harvard Business School. Ted Levitt, who was also a famous professor at Harvard Business School back in like the 60s. Ted Levitt has the quote attributed to him that says, I think it's like, customers don't want a 1/4-inch drill, they want a 1/4-inch hole. So this is a lot what understanding customers' jobs to be done. Like they're trying to achieve some outcome, and so they're very much problem focused. And we try to come there with our solution and like, hey, like look at our solution without really understanding like what is the outcome the customer is trying to get. And so jobs to be done puts this in really stark relief. And what you're hinting at is there's what, if you look at the jobs to be done framework, there are 3 different types of customer jobs. So briefly break down into functional jobs, emotional jobs, and social jobs. So a functional job has a functional outcome, usually increasing revenue, decreasing cost, decreasing risk, increasing optionality. There's emotional jobs have some sort of emotional benefit to the end user. So increase status, reduce anxiety, have better sort of knowledge, right? So the idea of like being more confident and like being able to achieve some do some tasks. So those are more status related, right? And then the social jobs, if we are in a particularly relevant if you're in government or an NGO or a nonprofit, where we are as humans not only in it for ourselves, but we're very pro-social in our behaviors. And so there's also things like I'm increasing access to healthcare or education or voting rights or whatever it might be that is for the broader sort of social good, right? And so those are all different ways to measure value. I think what you were pointing out, which I believe is true, is in B2B markets the functional jobs dominate. Now there's still emotional jobs, and I think this is a big unlock for marketers who really understand this, where emotional jobs are important, especially if you're in a sales context for B2B. There's an old cliche in the US that said no one ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, that's important. Like if you're leading a buying committee for a major piece of hardware or software for your business, there's real social risk and status risk to putting your name and saying, this is the product that I recommend we go with, right? You're not necessarily writing the check, like, where the price is, one way or the other, like the company's writing that check. But like at the end of the day, if that product doesn't work, everybody's be looking at you being like, hey, Jaryd, like what happened during the evaluation process? That product sucks, and you might lose a promotion. You might lose your job, right? And so those emotional jobs are important. But I think we could contrast that with the last time you ever saw a perfume ad. It's usually some beautiful woman or beautiful man dancing in a very luxurious environment. There's maybe somebody says some words in French that you don't necessarily know what they said. It's very ambiguous. And at the end, it says Dior or, Dolce & Gabbana or whatever, the new scent. And you're like, what does that smell like? I have no idea. I have no idea what that thing is, but it was all a very emotional advertisement, right? And if you're at all a sports fan in the US and you have to sit through television commercials, all the insurance companies here, who are, I guess, the only television advertisers left, they all try to be really funny. They just have like really funny ads. They don't talk at all about what their policies are or the prices or it's because to a certain extent, it doesn't matter. It's all insurance. I mean, I'm sure there's some insurance. Please, insurance people, don't write me any letters if you hear this. But the functional benefits are all pretty much the same. So they try to make this emotional connection. Coca-Cola tells you that a Coke equals happiness. Have a Coke and a smile, right? And right, it's family cheer. So you're right, but I think that there is an opportunity for marketers to not forget about the emotional outcomes that people care about in a B2B market.
Okay, cool. That's good to hear. That's really good to hear. So I guess when people sit down, you alluded to this before, where this expensive meeting happened for a client of yours, and they didn't talk about pricing, or he perceived they talk about pricing. What are some of the things that where people just completely butcher the process of getting pricing right? Like what are some of the things they just do completely wrong when they're thinking about setting a price?
Yeah. So, I think, a couple things come to mind. So, one is, I would go back to what I said earlier, which is, there's all this focus on the number and the price level rather than really focusing on how you're charging. So in the world of SaaS pricing, that would be like the pricing. There's 4 elements of what I call SaaS packaging. So pricing metrics, pricing model, your offer configurations and your price fences or price structure. So really having the conversation focused on the how you charge aspect versus the number. And then look, at the end of the day, we got to put a number on something. But, if I were giving advice to folks, I would spend the vast majority of my time on what the price tag goes on and very little time on what number goes on the price tag.
Right.
The other thing I think that folks get wrong or maybe just avoid is I think that there's a meme out there that you can't talk to customers about pricing. And I just think that it's flat out wrong. Like, in fact, as a company, as a business owner, you don't have a choice of if you will talk to your customers about pricing. You only have a choice about when. So the question is the first time you talk to your customer about pricing when the poor sales guy is having to quote a price to a customer after the product is launched? Like, is that really what you want to be? Because the price is going to come up. And so there's this idea that like, oh, until it's launched, until sales is talking to people, like we can't get any insight into our pricing from customers. And it's just absolutely not true. Look, there's absolutely better and worse ways to go about that conversation. But I think you end up in, it's interesting because I think you end up in a couple different camps. So let me, if there's any folks who have ever been in like a design space, right? Like, so you're designing a web page, for example. I know a bunch of user experience, researchers, designers who would just laugh me out of the room if I said, look, I can't show a customer a static view of a web page or a static view of a web app and get any useful feedback because it's not a live system. And so they're just not going to know what to do with it. It's like, no, that's absolutely 100% not true. Like right now, I bet you there's simultaneously 10,000 user experience testing sessions going on around the world where folks are doing exactly that and they're getting feedback. I think the other thing that happens, so one is just sort of this disbelief that like you can't do it. And I think the thing that happens is that people sort of don't necessarily think that they can get, I can't get like 100% accurate to the cent pricing information. So therefore, I'm not going to get any data, and I'm just going to go with what I have in my gut. So I think the people, I feel like they go from this extreme of like, well, if I can't get laser guided absolute precision, like it's worth whatever I just dreamt up in the shower this morning. Like, I'm sure that there's a sweet spot between those extremes of like, and so look, absolutely, willingness to pay and understanding like that number. Willingness to pay ultimately is an outcome, and it's an outcome based upon your desire for the product, and that's going to be subjective. Are you in a buying process right now? Like, is your need acute, right? If you're going to buy a bottle of water when you go to the gas station next time, how much are you going to pay for that? $2. But if you've been walking through the desert for, a week, like your willingness to pay is going to be significantly different versus, if I show you a one slide product concept and say, we have a properly formatted set of willingness to pay questions. I don't just say like, what would you pay for this? Which is a terrible way to go. I highly recommend you never ask the question that way. That's going to be different than
for everything.
$1. I'll pay $1. That's going to be very different from a 30-minute call with a salesperson who's running them through a demo and trying to understand how the specific needs of the customer. And that's going to be very different than a 7 or 14-day trial, where they've got the software in their environment, they've got it loaded. They're going to have a different perception of value, right? And so, and look, there's ways to think about how we get pricing information from all those contexts, right? And so I think it's a bit that I think that's probably one of the biggest fallacies is just like, well, it's impossible to get absolutely precise data, so we're not going to get any data at all. And I think people can get a lot more precise data than they even stand that they can get, which is probably one of the important factors.
How would they go about that? I guess because I mean it would be a great, it'd be nice to just. It's not the best way to go. It's like like you said before. It's like you have a sales call or a conversation with somebody. It's like, this is what this can do for your business. It'd probably save you this amount. How much would it be worth to you? And they say, $20 a month when the product costs you $100 a month, whatever it is, or $300 a month more. So how do they get this data that can actually set them up for success?
Well, that's useful feedback. I don't want to let that slide because that's useful feedback.
True.
if you talk to people and they tell you that I would pay X and your costs are Y and X is much less than Y, like you don't have a viable business. Like I just go stop what you're working on right now.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting point, and I there's a whole domain that folks probably don't even realize exists. It's called value engineering is the fancy term for it. But it really starts with this premise of we will only go build what customers tell us they're willing to pay for. And there's a whole set of science and art behind it. But it puts the customer and what they are willing to pay for at the front of the development process, which is, I got to say, a much better approach than what I tend to see a lot of software companies do, which is customer told us they wanted this thing. We never talked to them about price. So we went and spent millions of dollars developing it. And then they called me and say, hey, Dan, we're supposed to launch this thing in 2 months. We're in beta. It's pretty much already built. We're trying to figure out how to price it. And I go, no one has had that conversation yet. Like, you guys just invested millions of dollars in this thing. What if they come back now and say, I will pay you $20? And you're like, we spent millions of dollars on it. We thought they were going to pay $1,000. It's like, you could have had that conversation with a couple of mock-ups, like, 9 months ago and saved yourself 9 months of development time and millions of dollars. Like, so
and
now
this is the reason that 90% of startups fail.
So I was only pulling your chain there, but like I run into that situation more often than you think, where it's like, man, like if you ask someone those questions and they tell you way less than you were expecting, that is incredibly useful information. If you ask it at the right time and have the course of action that you can then figure out, like, okay, does that mean A, this is the wrong customer? B, we maybe our methodology is wrong and we just didn't describe the product correctly, right? Because I mean, look, companies have that a lot. We're like, hey, our messaging is wrong and like people don't get it. Like, if I just sit here and be like, confuse you, and then I ask you how much you're going to pay for something you don't understand, like that'd be very real. Like, yeah, that's not valid data, right? So there's an art to this, but or maybe it says, hey, like, if we want to actually go forward with this product, like, it's got to be significantly cheaper. And I think actually one of the best examples of this, give everyone a relatable example, is what Elon Musk did with Tesla. So, when he came out with the original Tesla Roadster, he identified a market that really cared and was willing to pay for the characteristics that an all-electric vehicle could offer, which was the Tesla Roadster. The guy who bought that for $250,000, or it's up there in range, could beat off the line all of his friends that had Lamborghinis and Ferraris, right? He didn't care about nationwide charging station infrastructure, or can I take it to the grocery store and fit my groceries in there, and like all these other, is there, a dealership near me that I can go kind of, poke around at? Although I did, and Elon also was smart and said, look, manufacturing cars at volume, at scale, is really hard. And like, it takes a lot of time to build up that competency to mass produce vehicles. Like, it's one of the most complicated, I mean, for sure, most complicated consumer items, but even in the B2B world, it's a really, I don't know, there's like 200 microchips in there. There's, all this like technology, especially when you're talking about EVs, that is, unproven. And so, and then, at the really high price point, low volume, and then eventually came out with something like the Tesla Model S, right? Still a premium luxury vehicle, not ultra luxury like a Ferrari, Lamborghini, but still at a, starting base price like 80,000 US, right? And with options that can go above into six figures, a little bit higher volume, but again, like, expanding a little bit more of the market. And then, finally gets to something like the Tesla Model 3. And, and so he really knew ahead of time of like, how can I price in line with what the expectations are going to be, my costs to support and deliver that, and then use that going forward in terms. I think we get to take the shortcut in the software world, which is our original cost to sell is so low, to support, it's like, oh, there's a database calls and some compute on AWS, and so we get to kind of skip a lot of those. But when you're selling cars, you really got to know like how you're going to produce them and what your costs produce and how that's going to go over time. So keeping that in mind, I think that's a really good example of you understanding your price positioning strategically and using it to really drive and be part of your strategy up front, like how you're going to go and meet, build a business over time.
Absolutely. I believe, what I say to people that I typically help people acquire businesses, but if they have something they're super passionate about and there's a product or service that doesn't yet exist, based on a need for something that a market really needs, is don't just create the product and then hope to sell it. Is first get the audience to create the product together based on what their wants, needs, fears, frustrations are, and desires are, and then you can reverse engineer it and build exactly what they want and you have that audience in front of you, and then you sell it to them. It's a smarter option.
And I don't want to leave your listeners hanging, because I know in there you asked me a question about like how do you get sort of willingness to pay data, and so there's a bunch of different techniques. Let me give just the quick lightning round. So one of them is you can just talk to your customers, right? And so you have a conversation around the value you're creating, the how this product is involved in their business, what that means to them in terms of the like how much it would improve. Talking to them about other alternatives they've tried or currently have in place, getting insight there, and then talking to them about sort of willingness to pay questions. In terms of if I was in a qualitative conversation, meaning I was in a direct conversation with a customer, one of the common techniques that we'll use is what's called the Van Westendorp. It's named after a Dutch economist who came up with it in the 60s or 70s. But there's basically 4 questions that you ask. At what price would this product be so cheap that you would question the quality and wouldn't buy it? At what price would you consider this product to be a bargain and you would buy it? At what price would you consider this product to be getting expensive but would still buy it? At what price would this product be prohibitively expensive and you wouldn't buy it? So that's you could use that in interviews, or you can use that in sort of in a more quantitative survey that you can put out to customers or people who sort of meet the profile of your customer. And then that would be what we would call like a direct questioning method, because I'm actually directly asking about price. There's a whole other class of research methods around pricing that are broadly talked about as indirect methods. So if anyone's ever heard the term discrete choice or conjoint, those are in that category where I am looking at trading off sets of features together with price. So imagine I'm going and shopping for a new laptop, and there's certain features of like the screen size and the display of the screen and the amount of memory and the CPU speed and the brand, right? And each of those I'm given a set of choices that each have a price point, and I say, hey, for each combination, which of these different products would you choose? And usually none is, I wouldn't choose any of them, is also an option. And you run customers or market participants through that, and you can get a very good sense of the type of capabilities they're willing to pay for, how much they value those individual capabilities. And so that type of research can be really valuable, especially if you don't see it as much in B2B, because just some of the limitations of the methodology make it a little bit difficult, because B2B products tend to ramp up the complexity a significant amount. So just for pragmatic reasons, it's used less. But if you're in B2C, you're selling smartphones, you're selling laptops, digital cameras, TVs, those are used incredible amount in there. Or even some of the more simpler sort of, I'm sure, Netflix, et cetera, the simpler sort of B2C type subscriptions use those methodologies a lot, right? And so if they're thinking about, hey, we're thinking about, releasing a new smartphone with, I don't know. It seems like the smartphone makers are going the same direction as the razor blade manufacturers. The razor blade manufacturers are like, let's add more blades, right? The smartphone makers are like, yeah. So like the next iPhone will have 20 cameras, or if we put 20 cameras on there, how would how would our market share change? And so you could run very advanced analytic simulations with that type of data as well. So hopefully that's useful for your audience. So there are structured ways to go about those type of questions to remove as much bias as you can, as you're trying to get that pricing insight from your target market.
All under the umbrella of like having a good conversation with the market and your customers, and
talk to your customers.
Yeah, raw, honest conversation. They're going to give you direct feedback. If anything, like, I like to tell people that I didn't actually grow my business. The market did, and my customers did, because they told me what they wanted. I just gave it to them for the price they were willing to pay. And I can't take all the credit for it because it's just asking the right questions at the right time to the right people. So, Dan, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can we send people to find out more about what you do?
Yeah, I'm happy to connect with folks on LinkedIn, Dan Balcauski. So if you send me a note, just attach a message, let me know you heard on the podcast so I could separate it from all the other LinkedIn spam. Also, I try to blog pretty regularly on my website, producttranquility.com. And also, I have my own podcast, and I'm in the midst of recording season 2 called SaaS Scaling Secrets. So I interview CEOs of scale-up B2B SaaS companies. So you can also check me out there wherever the podcasts are found. And so season 2 should be coming. Well, yeah, I'll let the release date be undefined at this point.
Don't put too much pressure on yourself, Dan. But yeah, awesome, guys. I'll put show notes. I'll put those links in the show notes, Dan. Again, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jaryd. I really enjoyed it.